On the edge of the Adriatic Sea, where the waves of history have always carried whispers of empire, invasion, and discovery, lies a mystery that continues to divide nations. Marco Polo, arguably the most famous traveler in human history, the man whose very name has become synonymous with exploration, remains an enigma even in the details of his birth. Was he truly a son of Venice, as the Italian Republic proudly proclaims? Or did he first open his eyes on the Croatian island of Korčula, a fortress town perched upon limestone cliffs, gazing out toward the vast horizon he would one day cross? To most of the world, Marco Polo is a Venetian. His story is tightly woven into the identity of La Serenissima, the most serene republic of Venice, whose merchants and fleets ruled the Mediterranean during the Middle Ages. Yet, across the Adriatic in Korčula, the locals tell a different tale. They point to stone houses, to dusty records, to oral traditions passed down through centuries, insisting that the legendary explorer was one of their own. This quiet dispute has simmered for generations, turning Marco Polo from a historical figure into a prize of cultural heritage, a man claimed by two proud peoples. But before we unravel the controversy, we must first understand the man himself, who Marco Polo was, why he matters, and how his life forever changed the course of global history. Imagine Europe in the 13th century. It was an age of knights and crusades, of plagues and feudal castles, of borders drawn and redrawn in endless wars. To the average European, the world was small, bounded by familiar horizons, the local village, the market town, perhaps the nearest cathedral city. Beyond that lay mystery, superstition, and fear. The East was not a place to be visited. It was a place of stories, of silk and spices, of strange peoples glimpsed only through rumor and legend. And then came Marco Polo. He was not the first European to reach Asia, but he was the first to tell its story in such vivid, captivating detail that it reshaped Europe's understanding of the world. His journey to China, across deserts and mountains, into the court of the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan, reads like an epic. The book that resulted from his travels, The Travels of Marco Polo, was not merely a chronicle of distant lands. It was a revelation. Europeans encountered descriptions of paper money, coal, porcelain, and cities larger and more sophisticated than any in Christendom. The work would inspire generations of explorers, most famously Christopher Columbus, who carried a copy with him on his voyage to the New World. Marco Polo became, in essence, a bridge between worlds. And so, the question of where such a man was born carries enormous symbolic weight. His birthplace is not just a line in a biography. It is a claim to the origin of curiosity itself, to the roots of global exploration. Venice insists the matter is settled. The city's archives, monuments, and traditions enshrine Marco Polo as one of their sons, a merchant prince of the lagoon whose family's wealth and connections enabled his journey. Tourists visit the supposed site of his house near the Rialto Bridge. Italian historians point to Venetian records that mention the Polo family, merchants of prestige and influence, embedded in the city's political and commercial fabric. To doubt Venice's claim, they argue, is to deny centuries of documented history. But in Korčula, the story takes a different turn. Walk through the cobblestone streets of the old town, encircled by medieval walls, and you will hear guides tell visitors that Marco Polo was born here, in 1254, in a stone house that still stands today. From the tower of St. Mark's Cathedral, locals point across the sea and say, "This is where the great traveler began." Croatian historians argue that the Polo family had Dalmatian roots, and that the Venetian claim was later elevated as Venice sought to monopolize the glory of his legacy. After all, in the 13th century, Dalmatia was under Venetian influence, its islands contested, its people caught between empires. Why not, then, could Marco have been a child of Korčula, growing up at the crossroads of cultures, where Venetian, Slavic, and Byzantine influences collided? The evidence is tantalizing but elusive. Venetian documents record the Polo family name, but their details are often sparse. Korčula preserves oral traditions, but oral traditions can blur fact and myth. Some scholars point to linguistic quirks, family ties, and the movement of merchants across the Adriatic as possible links. Others dismiss these claims as romantic nationalism, a local attempt to insert Croatia into a story dominated by Venice. And so the legend grows. To step into this debate is to step into the wider history of the Adriatic itself, a sea that has never been merely water, but always a contested frontier. Venice and Croatia, Italy and Dalmatia. These were neighbors, rivals, trading partners, and enemies, locked in centuries of competition for influence. To claim Marco Polo is to claim a symbol of cultural superiority, a golden thread in the tapestry of history. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this dispute is not whether Marco Polo was Venetian or Croatian. It is how the uncertainty itself fuels the myth. For Marco Polo was not simply a man of one city or one nation. He was a man of the world. His story transcends borders, much as his journeys did. To anchor him too firmly to one place may be to miss the point of his life entirely. And yet, the question lingers. It lingers because identity matters, because heritage matters, because in the stories we tell about the past, we see reflections of ourselves. For Venetians, Marco Polo embodies the spirit of mercantile daring, of ships that conquered the seas. For Croatians, he represents the often overlooked role of Dalmatia in shaping Mediterranean history, a reminder that greatness can emerge from small islands as well as great republics. As the sun sets over Korčula, casting golden light on the red-tiled roofs, one can almost imagine a boy staring out at the sea, dreaming of lands beyond the horizon. Was that boy Marco Polo? Or was he, instead, a child of Venice, gazing across the canals at ships departing for distant ports? The answer may never be known, but in the uncertainty lies the allure, the spark of mystery that keeps Marco Polo alive in our imagination. And as we peel back the layers of history, through dusty archives and half-forgotten chronicles, we will discover not only the debate over where Marco Polo was born, but also the larger story of why his name still matters today. This is not just the tale of a traveler. It is the story of how identity, pride, and memory are fought over, long after the man himself has vanished into legend. And in that struggle, we find not only Marco Polo's birthplace, but the birthplace of myth itself. If you walk today through the narrow streets of Venice, past the Rialto Bridge and into the labyrinthine alleys where merchants once shouted prices over barrels of spice, you will inevitably encounter his name, Marco Polo. In the city's tourist shops, he appears on maps, on books, on bottles of wine. In Venetian pride, Marco Polo is not just a historical figure. He is a son of the lagoon, the very embodiment of a city whose identity was built on exploration, trade, and the blending of East and West. The Venetian claim to Marco Polo's birth is powerful because it is woven into centuries of tradition and record. According to this version, Marco was born in 1254 in Venice itself, into a family of merchants whose influence extended far beyond the canals. His father, Niccolò Polo, and his uncle, Maffeo, were already seasoned traders, traveling across the Mediterranean and into Constantinople. The Polos were not obscure villagers. They were part of Venice's mercantile elite, tied by blood and marriage to the city's powerful networks of wealth and politics. Venetian historians point to several documents as evidence. In Venice's state archives, the Polo family name appears repeatedly, linked to merchant ventures, shipping registers, and property ownership. While not every detail is clear, the 13th century was a time when record-keeping was fragile. There is enough to establish the Polo family as a Venetian dynasty. The idea that Marco Polo might have been born elsewhere, they argue, is not just improbable but unnecessary. Why would such a prominent family, with established roots in Venice, see their most famous member born in a distant island town? In Venice itself, there stands what locals call the Casa di Marco Polo, the supposed house where he lived and perhaps was born. Though the original structure has long since been rebuilt, plaques and markers proudly declare the site as his birthplace. The house lies close to the bustling Rialto, where Venice's mercantile heart beats strongest. For the city, this is more than history. It is heritage, rooted in the very stones of the lagoon. Tourists visit, snap photos, and leave believing they have seen the cradle of one of history's greatest travelers. The story Venice tells about Marco Polo is not merely about one man. It is about the city itself. Venice in the 13th century was unlike any other place in Europe. a maritime republic built upon islands and canals, it had grown into a trading empire that reached from the Adriatic to the Levant. Venetian merchants dominated commerce in spices, silks, and precious goods, connecting Europe with the East long before Marco Polo ever set foot on the Silk Road. In this sense, Marco Polo is presented as the natural product of Venice's world. A city born of trade produced a man born to explore. The Venetian narrative also emphasizes how Marco Polo's journey fit seamlessly into the Republic's ambitions. When he traveled to the court of Kublai Khan, he was not merely a curious wanderer. He was part of a family mission rooted in commerce and diplomacy, in expanding Venetian influence and profit. His stories, then, were not just exotic tales. They were part of Venice's claim to be the true gateway between East and West. To diminish his Venetian origins would be to diminish the city's role in this grand history. But Venice's version of the story is not only supported by archives and monuments. It is also backed by centuries of cultural pride. Venetian writers, poets, and chroniclers consistently described Marco Polo as one of their own. In medieval chronicles, his name appears alongside other Venetian luminaries. In Renaissance art, he is painted as a symbol of Venetian daring. For centuries, no one questioned the claim, at least not in Italy. The debate about Korčula emerged later, as national identities hardened and local pride sought new anchors. Yet, even within Venice, there are complications. The precise location of Marco Polo's birth is uncertain. Even if one accepts that he was Venetian, records from the 13th century often blur dates and names, and family houses could shift from one district to another. Historians admit that while the Polo family is well documented, Marco's own birth certificate, so to speak, does not exist. This gap in the record leaves space for speculation, and speculation is the soil in which myths grow. Still, for Venetians, such ambiguity matters little. What matters is the continuity of tradition. For over 7 centuries, Venice has celebrated Marco Polo as its son. His tomb lies in the Church of San Lorenzo, though even here mystery persists. His exact resting place has long been debated, with no definitive marker. In this way, Marco Polo remains elusive, his presence felt but never fully pinned down. Venice's claim to Marco Polo is also part of a broader narrative of identity. Cities like Genoa, Florence, and Venice have always competed for cultural supremacy. To possess Marco Polo in history is to possess a symbol of global curiosity, of adventurous spirit. For Venice, his story reinforces the city's golden age, when its fleets controlled the seas and its merchants dictated the flow of wealth across continents. This is why guides in Venice still point proudly to the Casa di Marco Polo, why streets bear his name, and why Venice itself has never wavered in its assertion. Marco Polo was one of theirs. Yet, as we peel back the Venetian story, questions emerge. The 13th century was a time of constant movement. Merchants traveled, families relocated, records were patchy. Could it be possible, however unlikely, that Marco Polo's origins lay across the Adriatic? Could the great traveler, whose life embodied the blending of East and West, also embody the blending of two identities, Venetian and Dalmatian? Venice rejects the notion firmly. For them, Marco Polo belongs to the lagoon, just as surely as gondolas glide across its canals. To suggest otherwise is, in their eyes, a rewriting of history. Yet, as we will see, across the water in Korčula, the story is very different. There, Marco Polo is not a visitor from Venice, but a native son whose legend was stolen by a powerful republic. The Venetian claim, with its weight of tradition, monuments, and documents, may seem unassailable. But history, like the tides of the Adriatic, has a way of shifting. And in the shifting sands of memory, alternative stories emerge, demanding to be heard. Across the shimmering waters of the Adriatic, where the waves break against limestone cliffs and olive groves cling to the hillsides, lies the island of Korčula. Today, it is a quiet jewel of Croatia's Dalmatian coast, known for its medieval walls, its red-tiled roofs, and its winding cobblestone streets. But to the people of Korčula, their island holds a secret far greater than its beauty. They believe it is the true birthplace of Marco Polo. Unlike Venice, Korčula does not claim him with the weight of imperial records or towering archives. Its story comes instead from oral tradition, from local memory, and from a stubborn sense of identity passed down through generations. For centuries, islanders have whispered that Marco Polo was not born in Venice, but here, in a stone house that still stands inside the walls of Korčula town. To outsiders, it may seem like a romantic tale, but for locals, it is truth woven into the very fabric of who they are. The house in question is a modest structure, built of pale stone and narrow windows, like many others on the island. Today, it is proudly presented as the birthplace of Marco Polo. Visitors climb its ancient staircase, look out over the Adriatic from its tower, and imagine the boy who would one day cross deserts and mountains, beginning life in this small, fortified town. Guides tell stories of the Polo family as a clan of Dalmatian merchants, known on the island long before Venice claimed them as its own. The house itself may have been rebuilt over the centuries, but for Korčula, its significance is unshakable. So where does this story come from? The roots lie in the tangled history of Dalmatia itself. In the 13th century, Korčula was under Venetian rule, one of many territories absorbed into the Maritime Republic's empire. But its people retained their own culture, their own language, and their own traditions. Many island families, including those with the name Polo or its variants, lived here, trading with Venice but maintaining local roots. Some historians argue that Marco's family may have originated from Korčula and later moved to Venice, a migration that would explain both traditions. There are fragments of evidence, none definitive but intriguing. Local church registers and notarial records from the medieval period mention families with names resembling Polo or de Polo. These documents are not clear enough to directly tie Marco Polo to the island, but they reveal a possible lineage. Some scholars speculate that Marco's ancestors were Dalmatian merchants who relocated to Venice, integrating into its powerful networks while never completely severing ties to their homeland. If this is true, then Venice's claim and Korčula's claim are not mutually exclusive. Marco Polo could have been both, born in Korčula to a Dalmatian family and raised in Venice as part of its mercantile elite. But Korčula's claim rests not only on fragmentary documents. It thrives in legend. Islanders tell stories of Marco Polo's youth in Korčula, running through the fortified streets, watching the ships come and go from the harbor, dreaming of journeys beyond the horizon. They speak of his family as one of theirs, known long before history turned him into a Venetian icon. In local pride, Marco Polo is a Dalmatian sailor at heart, shaped not by Venice's grandeur, but by the rugged coastlines and seafaring traditions of his native island. The legend gained momentum in the 19th and 20th centuries, as nationalism spread across Europe and local identities hardened. For Croatians, claiming Marco Polo was a way of asserting their place in global history, of refusing to let Venice monopolize the legacy of the most famous traveler of the Middle Ages. In 1995, the town of Korčula officially declared itself Marco Polo's birthplace, erecting plaques, museums, and exhibitions to tell the story. The Marco Polo House became a tourist destination, a cultural statement as much as a historical one. Skeptics dismiss the Korčula story as myth-making, a clever tool for tourism and local pride. They argue that there is no solid proof, no birth record, no contemporary chronicle, no definitive tie between Marco Polo and the island. To them, Venice's archives remain more convincing, while Korčula offers only tradition and hearsay. Yet, tradition should not be underestimated. In cultures without centralized archives, oral memory often preserves truths overlooked by official records. It is possible that Venetian chroniclers deliberately emphasized Venice's role, downplaying or erasing Marco Polo's Dalmatian roots to strengthen their city's claim to greatness. History, after all, is written by the powerful. Could Marco Polo's birthplace in Korčula have been quietly erased from memory by the weight of Venetian authority? Adding to the intrigue is a curious fact. Marco Polo himself never explicitly stated where he was born. In his famous account, Illinois Million, known in English as The Travels of Marco Polo, he speaks in detail of his journeys across Asia, of Kublai Khan's court, of deserts, rivers, and palaces, but he never writes about his childhood or birthplace. Silence, in this case, is fertile ground for dispute. If he had mentioned Venice outright, the debate would vanish. But he did not, and so Korčula's claim finds space to breathe. Local historians also point to the Battle of Korčula in 1298, a naval clash between Venice and Genoa that took place right off the shores of Korčula. Marco Polo, by then a seasoned traveler, was captured by the Genoese in this battle. For the people of Korčula, the coincidence is telling. Marco Polo was captured in a battle fought at the doorstep of his homeland. To them, it is not coincidence but destiny, a reminder that the man who carried the name of Venice across the world may have begun his life in Dalmatia, only to be captured near the place of his birth. Today, Korčula embraces this identity with pride. Museums on the island dedicate themselves to Marco Polo's legacy, displaying maps, replicas, and artifacts that celebrate him as a native son. Cultural festivals in his honor bring together music, performance, and historical reenactments. For locals, Marco Polo is not just a historical debate. He is part of who they are. To visitors, the contrast between Venice and Korčula is striking. In Venice, Marco Polo is presented with grandeur, woven into the splendor of an imperial city. In Korčula, he is remembered in stone houses and narrow streets, in quiet traditions and whispered legends. Venice claims him with power. Korčula claims him with intimacy. One is the voice of empire, the other the voice of a small island community determined not to be forgotten. And so the debate continues. Was Marco Polo Venetian by birth, Dalmatian by blood, or both? The truth may never be known with certainty. But what is undeniable is that Korčula's story matters, not because it can be proven beyond doubt, but because it reflects the deeper question of how history is remembered, who gets to tell it, and how identity is forged across centuries. Marco Polo's life was defined by movement, by crossing boundaries and blurring cultures. Perhaps it is fitting, then, that his origins remain contested, shared between two worlds. Venice and Korčula each tell their version, each shaping the memory of the man in their own image. And somewhere, perhaps between the canals of Venice and the stone walls of Korčula, lies the truth. But the debate over Marco Polo's birthplace is not merely an academic puzzle. It is also a mirror of politics, nationalism, and the power of storytelling. In the next chapter, we will explore how this dispute has fueled centuries of rivalry, how each side has used history to build identity, and why the mystery of Marco Polo's birth continues to ignite passions to this very day. The story of Marco Polo's birthplace is not just a question of geography. It is a contest of identity, pride, and history, one that pits a global empire against a small island community. On one side stands Venice, the queen of the Adriatic, a city that once ruled the seas and commanded wealth beyond measure. On the other side stands Korčula, a fortified island town with narrow streets, limestone walls, and a population that could fit into a single Venetian neighborhood. And yet, against all odds, Korčula dares to challenge Venice's claim to the most famous traveler of the Middle Ages. This is more than a historical dispute. It is a cultural duel that reveals how nations and peoples fight to shape memory, how heritage can become a battlefield as fierce as any war. Venice, after all, has the advantage of power and paper. Its archives are vast, stretching back centuries, containing contracts, merchant records, and chronicles that testify to its dominance. Venetian historians proudly assert that Marco Polo was one of their own, a Venetian merchant, the son of Niccolò Polo, part of a family firmly rooted in the Republic's mercantile class. For them, the question is settled. Marco Polo is Venetian, period. But Venice's silence on certain details leaves cracks in the story. Nowhere in its archives is there a definitive record of Marco's birth. No baptismal document, no certificate, no official notation to tie him absolutely to the city. Instead, his identity rests on assumption, reinforced by the fact that his family lived and traded in Venice. To the Venetians, this is enough. To the people of Korčula, it is precisely this absence that keeps the door open to their version. Korčula's voice is different, less official, more intimate. It speaks through memory, through legends whispered across generations. Islanders insist that the Polo family was known locally long before they appear in Venetian records. They point to the De Polo families still present in Dalmatia, surnames they believe trace back to Marco's lineage. They point to the house inside Korčula's walls, claimed as Marco's birthplace. And they point to the Battle of Korčula, fought in 1298 at their shores, where Marco himself was captured. To them, the coincidence is too powerful to ignore. The contrast between Venice and Korčula is symbolic. Venice, a sprawling empire, represents the voice of power, the kind that rewrites history to suit its image. Korčula, small and peripheral, represents the voice of communities often forgotten by the grand narratives. And in this clash, the figure of Marco Polo becomes more than a man. He becomes a prize in a struggle over heritage, memory, and legitimacy. This tension is not unique. Across history, great figures often belong to many places at once. Homer's birthplace is disputed by at least 7 Greek cities. Alexander the Great is claimed by both Greece and North Macedonia. Even Christopher Columbus is surrounded by debates. Was he Genoese, Catalan, or something else? Marco Polo's story fits into this pattern. When a figure is larger than life, nations and communities fight to claim him. But why does it matter so much? Because Marco Polo is not just a historical character. He is a symbol. For Venice, claiming him reinforces its image as the hub of global trade, the city that connected Europe with Asia. To lose Marco Polo, even symbolically, would mean surrendering part of its myth of greatness. For Korčula, claiming him is about pride and recognition. It is about saying that even small places can shape history, that even a humble island can give birth to a man who changed the way the world was seen. This battle for identity intensified in the modern era. In the 19th century, as nationalism swept across Europe, histories were rewritten, identities sharpened, and heritage became a weapon of pride. Croatia, under Austro-Hungarian rule, sought to highlight its cultural distinctiveness. Korčula's legend of Marco Polo grew stronger, presented as evidence that Croatians had contributed to the great story of world civilization. At the same time, Venice, by then long past its imperial prime but still proud of its history, doubled down on its claim. The dispute was not just academic, it became political. In the 20th century, particularly after World War II, when Croatia was part of Yugoslavia, the idea of Marco Polo's Croatian roots became part of cultural diplomacy. Yugoslavia sought to emphasize its importance on the global stage, and claiming Marco Polo was part of that effort. Museums, monuments, and tourist campaigns declared Korčula as his birthplace. Meanwhile, in Italy, Venetian pride bristled at this claim. To Italians, it was nothing short of theft, an attempt to appropriate one of their greatest historical figures. The rivalry plays out even today. In Venice, the name Marco Polo is everywhere. Marco Polo Airport, Marco Polo Academy, streets and squares that bear his name. The city frames him as the quintessential Venetian merchant, the man whose travels exemplify Venice's spirit of exploration. In Korčula, Marco Polo is equally omnipresent. The Marco Polo House, the Marco Polo Museum, annual festivals reenacting his journeys. Tourists arriving in Croatia are told that they are visiting the birthplace of the world's greatest traveler. 2 cities, 2 narratives, each reinforcing its version of the truth. What makes this conflict so fascinating is not just the absence of evidence, but the presence of meaning. Venice and Korčula are not really fighting over a birth certificate. They are fighting over identity, pride, and memory. And in this sense, both sides are right. Marco Polo belongs to Venice because he lived there, traded there, and represented the city in his journeys. But he also belongs to Korčula because the island's traditions and possible lineage tie him to Dalmatian roots. In a way, Marco Polo's disputed birthplace mirrors his life itself. A crossing of boundaries, a blending of cultures, a story that cannot be contained within one city or one nation. Some scholars argue that we should not even search for a single answer. Instead, they suggest embracing the ambiguity, recognizing that Marco Polo is both Venetian and Dalmatian, a man of the Adriatic, shaped by a world where borders were porous and identities fluid. In the 13th century, the distinction between Venice and Korčula was not as sharp as it is today. Both were part of a larger maritime world, connected by trade, family ties, and politics. To demand one birthplace may be a modern obsession. To his contemporaries, Marco Polo may have simply been of the Adriatic. Yet ambiguity does not satisfy pride. Venice wants certainty, Korčula wants recognition, and so the dispute continues, played out in museums, tourist brochures, scholarly debates, and local pride. Each side tells its story, each claiming to guard the truth. But history is not only about documents and facts. It is also about memory, and memory often bends to the needs of identity. In this sense, both Venice and Korčula reveal something deeper, that history is not fixed, but shaped by those who tell it. Marco Polo's birthplace may remain uncertain, but the debate itself tells us more about the human need for belonging than any document ever could. As we move into the final chapter, the question remains, does it really matter where Marco Polo was born? Or is the mystery itself part of what keeps his story alive? His journeys reshaped Europe's view of the world, bridging east and west. Perhaps his birthplace, like his life, is meant to remain a crossroads, a story that belongs to many, not just one. The story of Marco Polo is like a river that refuses to be confined by borders. It twists and turns, passing through Venice, through Korčula, through the deserts of Asia and the palaces of Kublai Khan. And even after centuries, it remains restless, unsettled. Was he Venetian? Was he Croatian? Or was he something far larger, something that transcended the limits of geography? This is the question that lingers as we reach the end of his life's tale. The question of birthplace, though small compared to his vast travels, has taken on symbolic power. It is not only about where he was born, it is about who owns his story. And in that question lies a reflection of history itself, how memory is shaped, claimed, and fought over. Venice insists that Marco Polo is theirs. For them, he is a symbol of the city's golden age, the living embodiment of a maritime empire that connected east and west. They can point to the Casa di Marco Polo, to the Church of San Lorenzo where his tomb is said to lie, to the endless archives that document the Polo family as merchants and citizens of Venice. In their narrative, Marco Polo could not possibly belong anywhere else. He was Venetian in blood, in culture, in destiny. Korčula, however, tells another story. The people of the island whisper legends that Marco was born among their stone houses, that the Polo family name is proof of his roots, that the sea battle fought on their shores in 1298, when Marco was captured, was not coincidence, but a sign of his true origin. For them, the world's greatest traveler is their son. They're proof that even a small island can shape history. Both stories contain truth, and both contain silence. And perhaps that is fitting. Marco Polo himself was a man of stories and silences. He told of wonders in the East, of paper money, of black stones that burned like wood, of emperors who ruled over millions. Yet he never mentioned the Great Wall of China. He claimed to have served Kublai Khan, but his role is debated. Even his contemporaries wondered how much of his tale was truth and how much was embellishment. So maybe it is appropriate that his birthplace, too, is shrouded in uncertainty. Maybe Marco Polo was destined to remain elusive, impossible to pin down. But beyond the debate, one thing is undeniable: his impact on the world. Marco Polo changed Europe's imagination. Before him, Asia was a land of myth and rumor, spoken of by traders but scarcely understood. After him, it became a place of detail, of geography, of possibility. His book, The Travels of Marco Polo, spread across Europe like wildfire. It was copied, translated, retold. Some called it Il Milione, suggesting exaggeration, as if he told a million stories. But even skeptics could not ignore the scope of his vision. Generations of explorers grew up under his shadow. Christopher Columbus carried a copy of the travels on his voyage across the Atlantic, annotating its pages. Other adventurers, mapmakers, and scholars used Marco's accounts as a foundation for their own quests. His words became a compass pointing toward the unknown. And here lies the irony. Marco Polo's greatest contribution was not conquest, not empire, not invention. It was imagination. He expanded the limits of what Europeans believed was possible. He took them, through his words, into lands they had never seen. His gift was curiosity, and curiosity is the beginning of every great journey. When we look at the fight over his birthplace, we see two communities battling for ownership of this legacy. Venice claims him to reinforce its story as the gateway of East and West. Korčula claims him to prove that even the smallest place can birth greatness. Both are true in their own way. Both reveal something about the human need to belong, to connect to the extraordinary. And yet, if Marco Polo were here today, perhaps he would smile at the dispute. For his life was never about where he started, it was about where he went. The deserts of Persia, the mountains of Afghanistan, the vast cities of China. He crossed landscapes that few Europeans had ever dreamed of. He lived at the intersection of cultures, where languages, beliefs, and peoples converged. His very existence was proof that identity is not fixed, but fluid. Marco Polo belongs to Venice. He belongs to Korčula. But more than that, he belongs to the world. He belongs to every child who has ever looked at a map and wondered what lies beyond the horizon. He belongs to every traveler who has stepped into the unknown. He belongs to every storyteller who has sought to capture the wonder of discovery. And maybe this is the lesson of Marco Polo's disputed birthplace. That greatness cannot be confined. That history's most important figures are bigger than borders, bigger than nations. They belong not to one people but to all of us. The Adriatic debate, Venice versus Korčula, will go on. Museums will continue to stake their claims. Tour guides will continue to tell their versions. Tourists will continue to take their photos in both places. Perhaps that is part of the magic. The uncertainty keeps the story alive. The mystery fuels the imagination. And imagination, after all, was Marco Polo's greatest gift. So where was Marco Polo born? Venice? Korčula? Perhaps the answer is not a city or an island. Perhaps the answer is the sea. The Adriatic itself, with its restless waters, its shifting tides, its endless horizons. A place of crossings, of voyages, of in-betweens. Marco Polo was born of movement, of trade, of exchange. He was a son of the Adriatic world, of a culture that thrived on ships and sails, on curiosity and connection. That is the story worth remembering, because Marco Polo's legacy does not rest in a birthplace. It rests in the journeys that followed, in the bridges he built between worlds. He reminds us that the world is always larger than we think, that there is always something beyond the horizon, waiting to be discovered. And maybe, just maybe, that is why we still tell his story today. Because deep inside, we are all travelers. We are all searching for new lands, new ideas, new ways of seeing. Marco Polo's life is not just history. It is a mirror of our own restless curiosity. As you reflect on his tale, ask yourself, what is your horizon? What lies beyond the familiar streets of your life? What would you see if you dared to take the first step into the unknown? Marco Polo once stood on the shores of the Adriatic, watching the waves carry ships toward distant lands. Behind him lay his birthplace, whether Venice or Korčula, we may never know. Before him lay the vast unknown, and he chose to go. That choice changed the world. So perhaps the real birthplace of Marco Polo was not a house in Venice or a street in Korčula. Perhaps his true birthplace was that moment of decision, that instant when he looked at the sea and decided to cross it. That is where Marco Polo was born, in the act of courage, in the leap into the unknown. And now, I leave you with this. If Marco Polo could see the world differently, if he could dare to step beyond the horizon, what is stopping you? The greatest journeys do not begin with certainty. They begin with a question. Where will yours take you? If you enjoyed uncovering the mystery of Marco Polo's origins, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more hidden stories of history, and let me know in the comments. Do you believe Marco Polo was Venetian, Croatian, or simply a citizen of the world? Because sometimes, the greatest mystery is not where a journey begins, but where it leads.